They say God works in mysterious ways, but in Chicago, it's the men claiming to speak for him who are the most dangerous. My best friend Leo wouldn't have had to die if Reverend Silas Vance hadn't deleted the emergency call from the system and let him gasp for air in a windowless basement, just because he decided a black boy's life was an acceptable loss for his profit margin. You think you're special, Julian? You think you're some kind of digital miracle? Reverend Silas Vance's voice didn't just ring through the glass-walled sanctuary of Harmony Heights. It vibrated through my very marrow, drowning out the low hum of the Chicago skyline outside. He didn't scream. Men like Vance don't need to scream. Their bank accounts do the shouting for them. He lunged forward, his hand, soft from years of never doing an hour of manual labor, gripping my collar and hoisting my scrawny 14-year-old frame right off the designer leather bench. The eyes that usually twinkled with the Holy Spirit on Sunday morning live streams were now bloodshot pits of pure, unadulterated malice. He looked less like a man of God and more like a corporate demon that had just outgrown its human skin. God doesn't hear prayers from trash like you, Jules. You aren't a prodigy. You're a processor. A glorified algorithm for this ministry. If you ever mention Leo's name again, if you so much as whisper about what's happening in the server rooms, I will have your mother evicted and blacklisted from every shelter in Illinois before the sun goes down. Do I make myself clear? I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I stared directly into those bloated, greedy eyes. I wasn't listening to his threats. I was listening to his pulse, a frantic, erratic symphony of fear hidden beneath a $10,000 Tom Ford suit. I could hear his rhythm, and it was the sound of a man who knew his firewall was starting to crumble. It didn't start with threats. It started with a promise so bright it felt like a fever dream. Before I entered the shadows of Harmony Heights, my world was defined by the jagged edges of Southside Chicago. The heavy metallic screech of the green Line L train, the rhythmic thud of a basketball on cracked pavement, and an upright piano someone had abandoned next to a dumpster behind my apartment. It was missing 3 keys, the wood was scarred by Chicago winters, and it was horribly out of tune, but to me it was a ladder to the stars. I was 14 and I didn't just hear music, I heard frequencies. I could hear the colors in the noise, the way the city breathed in 440 hertz. My mama, Clara, would sit on our cramped linoleum floor, her hands raw and red from scrubbing hospital floors to keep the lights on, and stroke my hair. Julian, she'd whisper, music is the only language God never uses to tell a lie. Play with your heart, baby. The world can't take what's inside you. And then Reverend Silas Vance appeared. He stepped out of a charcoal black Cadillac Escalade like a king from a modern-day gospel. His suit was sharp enough to cut glass, his platinum cross blinded the noon sun, and he had a smile that could make you forget you were 2 months behind on rent. In the South Side, people didn't just respect him. They saw him as the blueprint for black excellence. He was the prophet of prosperity. I heard there was an angel playing Mozart in the projects, Vance said, his voice a rich baritone honey that seemed to expand the walls of our tiny living room. He walked toward me, the scent of expensive oud and new money, erasing the smell of poverty for just a moment. He placed a heavy hand, weighed down by a ring that probably cost more than our building, on my shoulder. Back then I thought it was a blessing. Now, I know it was the touch of an elite predator checking the weight of his kill. Sister. Vance turned to my mother, who was trembling with a mix of awe and desperation. God spoke to me in a dream about your boy. These hands weren't meant for the South Side. Let me take him to the Harmony Heights Academy. I'll give him the finest tech, the best education, and the world will finally see the glory God put inside him. Mama wept. Real ugly tears of relief. She fell to her knees and almost kissed the hem of his sleeve. Thank you, Reverend. Thank you for saving my boy. I looked at Mama, then at Vance. He was smiling at her, but his eyes were locked on my hands. He didn't see a child with a gift. He saw a biological supercomputer. He saw a way to automate his empire using a kid the world had already written off. The day I left, Mama packed me a small sandwich, the last bit of turkey we had. She stood on the sidewalk, waving until the Escalade turned the corner. I didn't know that it would be the last time I'd smell the faint scent of hospital disinfectant on her skin for a very long time. When the massive biometric security gates of Harmony Heights slid shut behind us, a cold chill raced down my spine. The place was a fortress of glass, steel, and fiber optic cables. It looked like a university from the future. But beneath the silence of the sterile hallways, I heard a sound. It wasn't a piano. It was a rhythmic electronic whining, the dull, constant thrum of massive server racks, and the muffled, frantic clicking of 100 keyboards. "Welcome to your destiny, Julian," Vance whispered in my ear. He didn't lead me to a music conservatory. He led me to a windowless, high-security basement that spiraled deep beneath the church foundation. The deeper we went, the colder the air became, smelling of ozone and recycled air. He pushed open a heavy, soundproof steel door. There were no sheet music stands, no orchestres, just a massive underground data farm. Dozens of black children, their faces pale from the blue light of monitors, were hunched over screens that roared with lines of code. They were tagging and sorting data, training the very AI algorithms that Vance used to target vulnerable elderly people for donations. Every child wore a clean white scholar uniform, looking like ghosts chained to a digital machine. "What is this, Reverend?" I asked, my voice cracking. Vance leaned down, his fingers tangling in my hair, gripping tight enough to make me wince. His voice wasn't honey anymore. It was venom. "This is where you earn your salvation, Julian. In this country, free is a lie told to the lazy. You want to be a star? You pay the price in bits and bytes. You want your mama to stay in that new apartment I rented for her? You work until your fingers go numb." He pointed to a workstation where a boy even smaller than me was shivering, his tiny hands shaking as he tried to resolve a complex encryption error. "That's Leo. He's going to show you how we pray with our keyboards down here." I stood there, surrounded by the deafening roar of cooling fans, and realized the truth. This sanctuary wasn't built on faith. It was built on the stolen future of kids like me, processed through a machine that didn't believe in God, only in profit. And Reverend Silas Vance? He wasn't a shepherd. He was the wolf who had convinced the sheep that the slaughterhouse was a palace. The first thing they take from you at Harmony Heights isn't your dignity. It's your voice. The morning after the biometric gates of the academy slammed shut behind me, effectively sealing my fate within its marble and glass fortress, I was introduced to the digital fasting protocol. Reverend Silas Vance, standing under a hologram of a soaring eagle in the main atrium, didn't call it a confiscation. He called it a cleansing. "Your devices are conduits for the world's noise, Julian," he whispered, his voice smooth as honeyed venom. He held out a silk-lined tray for my cracked iPhone, the only way I had to hear my mother's voice. To hear the frequency of the divine, you must first silence the frequency of the flesh. In the South Side, we knew about hunger, but this was a different kind of starvation. Isolation was the primary currency of Harmony Heights. By noon, I was back in the basement, the data farm that smelled of ozone, cheap polyester, and the metallic tang of recycled air. The transition from the saint of the pulpit to the slave driver of the server room was seamless for Vance. One moment he was quoting the Beatitudes, the next he was checking the CPU usage on our workstations like a plantation owner checking the weight of cotton. My workstation was labeled Unit 7. There was no sheet music, no Steinway, just a dual monitor setup and a pair of industrial-grade noise-canceling headphones. My task was tonal tagging. Vance's complex AI required human ears to identify the emotional triggers in voice recordings. I spent 14 hours a day listening to thousands of snippets of elderly people, mostly poor, mostly religious, crying as they described their financial struggles. My job was to isolate the frequencies of desperation, faith, and submission, so the AI could learn how to better manipulate them into donating their last Social Security checks to Vance's prosperity fund. Labor is prayer, Julian, Vance rumbled, walking the rows of hunched-over children. His diamond ring caught the blue light of the monitors, casting sharp, jagged reflections across the pale, hollow-eyed faces of the other boys. You want to be a star? You want to see your mother in that penthouse I promised? Then you give me the data. You give me the desperation frequency by sundown, or you don't eat. It was the ultimate gaslighting. He made us feel like our exploitation was a form of spiritual discipline. He convinced us that if we failed, it wasn't because the system was rigged, but because our faith was weak. That's when I noticed Leo again. He was sitting at Unit 6, his small frame almost swallowed by the ergonomic chair. Leo was a math ghost. His fingers moved across the keyboard in a rhythmic staccato pattern that felt like a frantic percussion piece. But every few minutes, his rhythm would break, interrupted by a wet, hacking cough that echoed the sour, sickly sound I used to hear from my mother back in the projects. Leo was suffering. The basement was cold to keep the servers from melting down, but the air was thick with the fine dust of industrial cooling fans. For a kid with chronic respiratory issues, it was a slow-motion execution chamber. "Hey," I whispered during a rare 5-minute sanctification break. "You okay?" Leo didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on a string of binary code. "The fans. They're at 40 decibels, he muttered, his voice thin and trembling. "If they hit 45, I can't hear the numbers. If I can't hear the numbers, the Reverend says I'm spiritually stagnant. And stagnant things get discarded, Julian." Before I could respond, a shadow fell over us. It was Beatrice, the head matron of Harmony Heights. To the outside world, she was a pillar of the Black community, a woman who had dedicated her life to saving at-risk youth. To us, she was Judas in a floral Sunday dress. She didn't use a whip. She used a tablet to log our infractions. "Julian, back to your station," Beatrice said, her voice lacking even a shred of the warmth she displayed in the promotional videos. "Leo is under the Reverend's special care. Do not interfere with his progress." "He needs a doctor, Beatrice," I said, my voice cracking with the same desperation I was supposed to be tagging in the audio files. "His chest. It sounds like a broken bellows." Beatrice leaned in, the scent of hospital-grade peppermint failing to mask the coldness in her eyes. "In this house we rely on the great physician Julian. If Leo's lungs are heavy, it's because his heart is burdened by disobedience. Don't let your heart become heavy too, or your mother might find her charity apartment keys stop working by morning." The threat was a physical blow. Vance had designed a system where our love for our families was the very chain that kept us at the machines. Every time I thought about resisting, I saw my mama's face wave goodbye on that South Side sidewalk, believing she had finally given me a life worth living. I put my headphones back on. The desperation frequency was easy to find. It was the sound of my own breath. But Vance made a mistake. He thought that by taking away my piano, he had taken away my power. He didn't realize that to a kid who grew up playing a rotting dumpster piano missing 3 keys, music isn't about the instrument. It's about the math of the universe. One night, while Vance was in his glass office upstairs, likely drinking a vintage wine that cost more than my mother's annual salary, I stayed late. I wasn't tagging data. I was listening to the building. Everything in Harmony Heights had a frequency. The server racks hummed at 60 hertz. The biometric locks on the elevator chirped at 2.4 kilohertz. And the voice-activated safe in Vance's office, the one where he kept the physical ledgers and the offshore account keys, had a specific melodic sequence every time he spoke the password resurrection. I closed my eyes and let the blue light of the monitor fade away. I wasn't a processor anymore. I was a recorder. I began to hum the password sequence, transposing the syllables of his voice into musical intervals.
Resurrection.
D sharp, F natural, G flat, B flat. I realized then that this smart campus was nothing more than a giant instrument. And if I could learn to play the building, I could play Silas Vance. I looked over at Leo. He was slumped over his keyboard, his skin looking gray under the fluorescent lights. He was the personification of the stolen innocence Vance was using to fuel his empire. "I'm going to get us out of here, Leo," I whispered, the words lost in the roar of the machines. Leo didn't look up, but his fingers tapped a tiny Morse-like rhythm on the desk. So, at that moment, the door to the basement opened. Reverend Vance stepped in, his platinum cross reflecting the blue glow of the data farm like a predator's eye. He walked straight to Leo's station and looked at the boy's lagging productivity chart. "It seems the flesh is failing the spirit, Leo," Vance said, his tone terrifyingly calm. He didn't offer medicine. He didn't offer rest. He simply reached down and turned off Leo's workstation. "If you cannot contribute to the harvest, perhaps you belong in the quiet room for a period of extended prayer." The quiet room was a euphemism for a concrete isolation cell near the boiler pipes. "No, please." I stood up, my chair screeching against the floor. "I'll do his quota. I'll work his shift and mine. Just let him stay where there's a fan." Vance turned his gaze toward me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Julian, always trying to negotiate with God. You want to save him? Then you better find me a new way to harvest the Southside donors by tomorrow morning. If not, well, God gave and the Reverend takes away. He gestured for 2 security guards to haul Leo away. As they dragged him out, Leo's small hands reached out, grasping at the air, his eyes wide with a terror that no frequency tag could ever truly capture. I sat back down, the silence of the basement now louder than the servers. I realized then that I wasn't just in a data farm. I was in a war. And Silas Vance was about to find out that when you train a wolf to hear the truth in the noise, eventually, that wolf hears the sound of your own heart stopping. The quiet room wasn't quiet. For someone who heard the world in frequencies, the concrete cell near the boiler pipes was a screaming hell of industrial friction. It was located at the lowest point of Harmony Heights, where the trilling of high-voltage cables met the low-frequency rumble of the Chicago sewer system. They had thrown Leo in there 48 hours ago, and every time I closed my eyes to tag another donor's voice, I could hear the rhythmic, desperate scratching of his fingernails against the metal door. I was working double shifts now, 20 hours of staring at blue-lit monitors, my ears ringing with the sounds of crying grandmothers from the South Side. Reverend Silas Vance had made it clear, my education was no longer about music, it was about efficiency. I was the architect of his new faith-based analytics, using the very frequencies of black pain to build a more effective trap for his prosperity fund. "Focus, Julian," Matron Beatrice whispered, her hand resting on my shoulder. It was supposed to be a comforting gesture, but her palm felt like lead. "The Reverend is expecting the grief algorithm to be finalized by the weekend. Think of the children you're helping. Think of your mother." I pulled my headphones down, the silence of the room feeling like a physical weight. "How many children have actually graduated from here, Beatrice?" She stiffened, her floral Sunday dress rustling. A sharp, dissonant sound. "They all move on to higher calling, Julian. Some to our satellite campuses in the Caribbean, others to private internships. Then why did I find this? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. I had found it wedged behind a loose server rack, while I was searching for a way to override the lock on the quiet room. It was a letter written in the shaky, unformed hand of a child much younger than me. Mama, please come. The Reverend says you forgot me, but I know you didn't. My chest hurts and the machines are so loud. I don't want to pray with my hands anymore. I want to come home. The letter was dated 3 years ago. The ink was smeared with what looked like dried tears. Beatrice's face went pale, the mask of the pious protector, slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal a woman haunted by her own choices. She snatched the paper from my hand and walked toward the industrial shredder in the corner. In this country, Julian, we have to make sacrifices to survive. I did what I had to do so I wouldn't end up back in the gutter. You would be wise to do the same. Is that what you told Leo? I hissed. That his death is just a sacrifice for your comfort? She didn't answer. The shredder roared, a high-pitched, grinding C-sharp that felt like a needle in my brain. The minor drama of the academy wasn't just about the labor. It was about the systematic erasure of our humanity. Vance didn't just want our work. He wanted us to believe we were unworthy of anything else. He used the Bible like a scalpel, cutting away our self-worth until we were nothing but empty vessels for his data. Later that night, the building began to speak to me again. Vance was hosting a private dinner in the penthouse for a group of elite stakeholders, men in silk suits who viewed the South Side not as a community, but as an untapped resource. Through the ventilation shafts, I could hear the clink of crystal and the low, predatory rumble of their laughter. I tuned my workstation to the internal security microphones. I shouldn't have been able to access them, but Vance's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. He believed a glorified ATM, like me, couldn't understand the complexities of his network. The boy in the basement, Leo? He's becoming a liability, Silas, a voice rumbled. I recognized it as Dr. Halloway, the academy physician, who never actually saw patients but signed all the medical waivers. His respiratory failure is imminent. If we call an ambulance now, we can't explain the lack of ventilation in the server rooms. Then don't call one, Vance's voice responded, as smooth and cold as a funeral shroud. He's a ward of the state under my guardianship. If he passes during a period of intense spiritual fasting, it's a tragedy, not a crime. Besides, I've already reallocated the medical budget for the new wing at the Florida estate. A heart transplant for a donor's son took priority. This kid. His heart was never in the work anyway. I felt a surge of nausea. They weren't just neglecting him. They were calculating his expiration date like a piece of depreciating hardware. To them, Leo wasn't a child. He was an acceptable loss in a spreadsheet. I stood up, my heart hammering a frantic 120 BPM rhythm against my ribs. I had to get to the quiet room. I had to get Leo out before his frequency went silent forever. I waited until the sanctification hour, the time when the guards were distracted by the mandatory evening prayer broadcast. I slipped out of the data farm, moving through the shadows of the marble hallways. Every floor tile I stepped on had a different resonance. I memorized them, a map of sound that led me deeper into the foundation. When I reached the steel door of the quiet room, the smell of mold and damp concrete was overwhelming. I pressed my ear to the cold metal. Thump, thump, cough. It was the sound of a dying engine. Low. I whispered, Julian. The voice was barely a rasp, a ghost of a sound. I can't hear the numbers anymore. It's just dark noise. I'm here, Leo. Hold on. I pulled out a small electronic bypass I had cobbled together from spare server parts. My hands were shaking, the frequencies of fear making it hard to concentrate. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered. A voice boomed over the intercom. Not the calm recorded prayer but Vance's live amplified roar. "Julian Reed. Step away from the door." I froze. He was watching. He had always been watching. Vance stepped out of the elevator at the end of the hall, his platinum cross reflecting the dim red emergency lights. He looked down at me, his face twisted in a look of profound disappointment, as if I was the one who had betrayed him. "You were meant for greatness, Julian," he said, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "I offered you a seat at the table of the elite. I offered your mother a life of dignity. And you choose to throw it all away for a broken key like Leo. He's a human being, Silas." I shouted, the name a curse in my mouth. "He's not a key. He's a child." Vance walked toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the concrete like a metronome of doom. "In this world, Julian, there are those who play the music and those who are the music. You were born to be played. And if you won't harmonize with my vision, then you are nothing but noise." He reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "You want to be with your friend? Fine. You can share his quiet room until the morning. Let's see if your miracle frequencies can find a way through 6 inches of reinforced steel." He threw me into the cell. The door slammed shut with a final metallic thud that signaled the end of my hope. In the darkness, I felt a small cold hand reach out and touch mine. Leo was shivering, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps that sounded like a violin string about to snap. "Julian," he whispered. I found the last number. In the wall. Behind the pipe." Even in the face of death, the math ghost hadn't stopped calculating. I pulled him close, the frequencies of our shared terror merging into a single defiant chord. Silas Vance thought he had silenced us. He thought he had buried the truth under a mountain of glass and gold. But he forgot one thing about music. The most powerful sounds are often the ones you can't hear until it's too late. The quiet room wasn't the end. It was the resonator. And tomorrow we were going to make the whole of Chicago hear our song. The darkness of the quiet room wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical weight, thick with the smell of stagnant water, and the hum of the high-voltage lines that fed Silas Vance's digital empire. Every few seconds the boiler behind the wall would groan, a low-frequency shudder that felt like a dying heartbeat. In the corner, Leo's breathing had slowed to a shallow rhythmic rattle. It was a 60 BPM cadence of failure, a sound I knew all too well from the hospital wards in the South Side. "Julian," Leo's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the mechanical drone. "The number. Behind the pipe. It's not just math. It's the beat." I crawled toward him, my hands scraping against the rough, cold concrete. I reached behind the rusted iron pipe that ran vertically through our cell. There, etched into the mortar with what must have been a stolen screwdriver or a jagged piece of server casing, was a string of digits. But as my fingers traced the carvings, I realized they weren't just numbers. They were intervals. 1.618. 440. 528. Leo, the math ghost, hadn't just been calculating productivity. He had been mapping the resonance of Silas Vance's crimes. He had been documenting the frequencies of the sonic ledger. "What is this, Leo?" I whispered, pulling him closer to share what little warmth my body had left. "The Reverend. He thinks everything is data." Leo coughed, a jagged, discordant sound that made my own chest ache. "But data has a sound. Every time he moves money. Every time he deletes a file about a discarded student. The server hub in the wall clicks. It's a specific pitch. I've been counting the clicks for 2 years, Julian. That number. It's the master frequency to the encrypted backup. It's the only thing he couldn't hide because he didn't think anyone was listening to the noise. My heart skipped a beat. In the world of high-frequency trading and digital encryption, everyone looks at the code. No one looks at the physical vibration of the hardware. But to a kid like me, who grew up hearing the C-sharp of the Green Line train before it even arrived at the station, the world was nothing but vibration. "He's upstairs now, isn't he?" Leo asked, his eyes fluttering in the dark. "Yeah," I said, looking up at the ceiling where I could faintly hear the muffled vibrations of a string quartet. "He's hosting his visionary gala. He's telling a room full of people in $5,000 dresses how he's saving us. He's probably serving champagne while you're down here fighting for a breath." The hypocrisy was a sour taste in my mouth, more bitter than the Chicago smog. Silas Vance was the ultimate elite. He had used the language of our ancestors, the spirituals, the grit, the black excellence, and weaponized it into a cage. He was selling a version of the American dream that required the literal blood and breath of children from the South Side to stay afloat. And the worst part? The people upstairs wanted to believe him. They wanted to feel good about their donations, while ignoring the fact that the smart campus was built on a foundation of stolen innocence. I looked at the etched numbers again. If Leo was right, these weren't just frequencies, they were the keys to the kingdom. If I could get to a terminal, any terminal, I could play these frequencies into the system and trigger a bypass. I could unlock the sonic ledger, the hidden record of every dollar laundered, every child exploited, and every medical request denied. But we were locked in a reinforced steel box. "Julian," Leo whispered, his hand clutching mine. It was ice cold. You have to play the building. The ventilation shaft. It's a natural resonator." I looked up at the small, grated vent near the ceiling. It was too small for a body, but sound? Sound could travel through it like a highway. Suddenly, the intercom in our cell crackled to life. It wasn't the Reverend this time. It was Beatrice. Her voice sounded different, shaky, stripped of its piousness. "Julian? Can you hear me? We're dying down here, Beatrice," I shouted back, my voice echoing off the concrete. "Leo can't breathe. Does your higher calling include watching a 7-year-old suffocate?" There was a long silence, filled only by the distant, festive thrum of the gala above us. Then the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back. The door creaked open. Beatrice stood there, her face illuminated by the dim red light of the hallway. She wasn't wearing her floral Sunday dress. She was in a dark trench coat, her eyes red from crying. She held a small, portable oxygen tank and a tablet. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered, rushing to Leo's side and fitting the mask over his face. "The Reverend. He told me we were giving you a chance. He said the work was the only way to save you from the streets. But tonight, I heard him talking to the board members. They're planning to archive the basement kids once the AI is finished. They're moving the operations to an offshore facility where the labor laws can't touch them." Archive? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the boiler room. "You mean get rid of us?" "He thinks you're just noise, Julian," Beatrice said, handing me the tablet. "But I saw what you did with the jazz codes. I saw how you helped Leo. This tablet is connected to the internal Wi-Fi bridge. It's restricted, but if you can get past the encryption—" "I don't need to get past the encryption," I said, my fingers flying over the screen. "I wasn't looking for a password. I was looking for the audio driver. I have the master frequency." I showed her the numbers Leo had etched in the wall. Beatrice looked at them, then back at me, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and awe. "That's the resonance of the server hub. If you play that through the bridge, it'll create a harmonic feedback loop," I finished. It'll force the encrypted backup to synchronize with the public server to prevent a crash. For about 60 seconds, everything Silas Vance has hidden will be visible on every screen in this building. I started to program the sequence. I translated Leo's intervals into a digital waveform. 1.618. The golden ratio. Vance thought he was a god, so he used the math of the universe to hide his gold. He was so arrogant he thought no one else would recognize the pattern. But as I worked, a new drama unfolded on the tablet's news feed. Silas Vance had just taken the stage at the gala. He was standing in front of a giant LED screen, holding a photo of me and Leo from our first day. "Look at these faces," Vance's voice echoed through the tablet speakers. "These are the children of the new Chicago. They came to us with nothing but talent and hope, and through the grace of our curriculum, they are building the future of global finance." Julian Reed, a boy from the projects, is now the lead architect of our latest AI project. Tonight, we celebrate their victory. Tonight, we celebrate the triumph of faith over circumstance. The crowd roared. The hypocrisy was so thick it felt like it was choking me. He was using our faces to solicit more millions, while we were sitting in a basement with an oxygen tank provided by a woman who had finally found her conscience too late. "Julian, hurry," Beatrice urged, looking at the security monitors on her phone. "The guards are doing their rounds. If they see the cell door open..." "Almost there," I muttered. I wasn't just sending the frequency. I was attaching a file. I was attaching the recording of Vance and the doctor discussing Leo's acceptable loss. I was attaching the video of the data farm. I was attaching the sonic ledger in its raw, ugly entirety. "Julian," Leo gasped, the oxygen giving him a momentary burst of clarity. The high-pass filter. You have to set it to 15 kilohertz. That's the frequency of the Reverend's biometric lock." I looked at him amazed. Even now, his mind was a machine. I adjusted the slider on the tablet. "Okay," I said, my finger hovering over the transmit button. "This is it. This is the moment the music stops." But just as I was about to press it, the door to the boiler room was kicked open. Silas Vance stood there, his Tom Ford suit perfectly pressed, his platinum cross gleaming. But his face was the mask of a predator who had just realized his prey had teeth. He wasn't alone. Two large men in security uniforms stood behind him, their hands on their holsters. "Beatrice," Vance said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I expected better from a woman of your standing. To think you'd betray the ministry for a few pieces of noise." He looked at me, then at the tablet in my hand. He didn't rush me. He didn't need to. He had the power, the money, and the guns. "Give it to me, Julian," Vance said, extending his hand. "You have a choice. You can give me that tablet, and I'll make sure your mother is taken care of for the rest of her life. Or you can press that button and I will make sure she and you disappear into the system before the first file even finishes uploading. You know how this country works. Men like me don't lose to kids like you." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 400 years of history. It was the elite versus the underdog. It was the master versus the miracle. I looked at Leo, whose eyes were filled with a terrifyingly calm resolve. I looked at Beatrice, who had finally stopped trembling. And then I looked at Silas Vance, the man who thought he owned the frequency of my soul. "You're right, Silas," I said, my voice steady. "Men like you don't lose. Not until the music changes." I didn't press the button on the tablet. Instead, I looked up at the ventilation shaft. I had already set the tablet to auto-broadcast a high-decibel burst of the bypass frequency through the internal speakers of the building. I had been playing the building the whole time. Suddenly, a high-pitched, piercing tone shattered the silence of the boiler room. Upstairs, the gala's sound system began to hum with a deafening 15 kilohertz feedback loop. Vance's eyes went wide. He lunged for me, but it was too late. The screens upstairs weren't showing our faces anymore. They were showing the ledger. They were playing his voice. The sonic ledger had just gone live to the world. And the first thing everyone heard was Silas Vance saying, "A black boy's life is an acceptable loss." The drama of the basement was no longer a secret. The Tan Duong Trong Bong toy had just been hit by a floodlight. "Karma," I whispered, as the security guards' radios began to explode with frantic calls from the FBI agents who had been embedded in the gala's waitstaff. "It's a frequency you can't outrun." The sound that filled the boiler room wasn't just a frequency. It was the death rattle of an empire. Upstairs, in the grand ballroom of Harmony Heights, the 15 kilohertz feedback loop had shattered the crystal flutes of champagne and sent the elite of Chicago scrambling for the exits. But as the sonic ledger synchronized with the public servers, the panic turned into a localized, horrified silence. The giant LED screens, which had been displaying images of Vance's charity work, were now flickering with the raw, ugly truth. The voice of Reverend Silas Vance, amplified by the very system he used to preach prosperity, boomed through the building. "A black boy's life is an acceptable loss. Archive the basement, kids. Move the operations offshore where labor laws can't touch them." In the basement, Vance stood frozen, his Tom Ford suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The high-pitched tone of the bypass was still ringing, a sharp C-sharp that seemed to vibrate the very platinum cross on his chest. For the first time since I had met him, the prophet of prosperity looked small. He wasn't a giant. He was just a man caught in the spotlight of his own shadow. "You think this changes anything, Julian?" Vance hissed, his voice trembling with a frantic, erratic rhythm. He gestured to the two security guards, their hands hovering over their weapons. "This is Chicago. I own the precinct. I own the headlines. By tomorrow morning, this will be labeled a deepfake attack by digital terrorists. And you'll be just another statistic from the South Side." I looked at him, not with fear, but with the cold clarity of someone who had finally mastered the frequency of his enemy. "You forgot one thing, Silas. You didn't just build this place on data. You built it on the stolen innocence of kids like us. And innocence has a way of haunting the frequency." Beside me, Leo gasped for air through the oxygen mask Beatrice had provided. His small hand was still clutching the tablet, his fingers twitching in a rhythmic, Morse-like pattern. He was fading, his frequency dropping to a dangerous low-decibel hum. "Julian," Leo whispered, the mask fogging with every labored breath. The FBI signal. It's locked onto the bypass. Or, he's here." Just as Vance took a step toward me, the heavy steel door of the boiler room was kicked open for the second time that night. But this wasn't another predator. Marcus Thorne, the billionaire tech mogul who had been the guest of honor at the gala, stepped into the dim red light. He wasn't wearing his tuxedo jacket anymore. He was wearing a tactical vest, and behind him stood a team of federal agents, their jackets emblazoned with FBI in high-contrast yellow. "Reverend Vance," Thorne said, his voice a calm, resonant bass that cut through the mechanical noise of the basement. "I believe the visionary gala has concluded. Your auditors have arrived." Vance's security guards immediately drew their weapons, but they were outmatched. The red dots of laser sights danced across their chests like a synchronized light show. "Thorne!" Vance shouted, his face contorting into a mask of desperate arrogance. "This is a private ministry. You have no jurisdiction here. I am a man of God." "No, Silas," Thorne said, stepping forward until he was inches from Vance's face. You're a man of greed who used God as a firewall. But Julian and Leo just crashed your system. We've been monitoring the Sonic ledger since the moment it went live. We have the offshore accounts, the human trafficking logs, and the recordings of you discussing the disposal of these children. Vance lunged for the tablet in my hand, a last pathetic attempt to delete the truth. But one of the agents intercepted him, pinning him against the cold concrete wall. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful percussion I had ever heard. A sharp metallic F-sharp that signaled the end of the Black Caesar's reign. Julian Reed, Thorne said, turning to me. He looked down at Leo, then at the oxygen tank. His eyes, usually so calculating and distant, were filled with a raw, protective fire. You did it, kid. You played the building. Save Leo, I said, my voice finally breaking. Please. He's the one who found the frequency. He's the one who kept the math when everything else was noise. The agents moved with clinical efficiency. A medical team rushed in, lifting Leo onto a stretcher. As they rolled him out, he reached out and grabbed my sleeve. Julian, he wheezed, a tiny smile flickering on his pale face. The fans, they stopped. I can finally hear the silence. I watched them take him away, the red emergency lights reflecting in the tears I finally allowed myself to shed. Beatrice stood in the corner, her hands cuffed, watching the empire she had helped build being dismantled in minutes. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a hollow, silent apology, but the frequency of her betrayal was a sound I would never be able to unhear. Thorne placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip steady and warm. Nothing like the predatory touch of Silas Vance. Your mother is safe, Julian. We picked her up an hour ago. She's waiting for you at the field office. As we walked out of the basement, past the rows of data farm workstations where other children were being let out by social workers, I saw Vance being marched toward a waiting police cruiser. A crowd of Southside residents, the very people he had exploited, had gathered outside the gates of Harmony Heights. They weren't cheering for him anymore. They were holding up their phones, showing the Sonic ledger to the world. Vance tried to hide his face with his cuffed hands, but the platinum cross around his neck caught the blue and red strobe lights of the police cars, flashing like a beacon of his own hypocrisy. The church in the darkness was no longer a secret. The education of Julian Reed had started in the projects with a rotting piano and ended in a smart campus with a digital revolution. As the car door slammed shut on Silas Vance, the silence of the night was broken by the distant, rhythmic tolling of a church bell. It was a 1.618 Hz resonance, the golden ratio. Justice, I realized, didn't always come in the form of a miracle. Sometimes it came in the form of a kid who knew how to listen to the noise until it finally made sense. The FBI field office in downtown Chicago was a labyrinth of glass, brushed steel, and the hum of high-speed servers. A sterile mirror to the basement of Harmony Heights, but without the scent of desperation. For hours, the only sound I could focus on was the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. A precise 60 Hz metronome that felt like it was counting down the remaining seconds of my old life. My mother, Clara, sat beside me, her hands, still scarred and rough from years of scrubbing hospital floors, clutching mine so tightly I could feel her pulse racing against my palm. Julian, she whispered, her voice thick with a mix of hospital-grade disinfectant and the first hint of peace I'd heard in months. You don't have to play another note if you don't want to. We're going home. But I knew home was a concept that had been incinerated the moment Silas Vance stepped out of that charcoal black Escalade in the Southside projects. Vance hadn't just stolen my time. He had attempted to rewire my soul into a digital algorithm for profit. The heavy door to the waiting room opened, and Marcus Thorne stepped in. His face, usually an unreadable mask of elite tech authority, was etched with a grim solemnity. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at me, then at my mother, and the frequency of the room shifted. It dropped into a low, mournful minor chord. Low? I asked, my voice barely a thread. Thorne sat across from us, leaning forward. The medical team at Northwestern did everything they could, Julian. But the respiratory failure was too advanced. The dust from the server cooling fans. The lack of a basic inhaler. It was too much for his heart to overcome. The air left my lungs as if I'd been struck. Low. The math ghost who had mapped the frequencies of a monster's crimes. The boy who had spent his final hours etched intervals into a concrete wall so I could play the building. He was gone. The acceptable loss Silas Vance had calculated in his spreadsheet had become a permanent reality. He died listening to the silence, Julian, Thorne said softly. He told the nurse he could finally hear the numbers clearly. I felt a surge of white-hot rage that vibrated at a pitch so high it was almost silent. This was the true face of the elite in America. To Silas Vance, we weren't children. We were a gold mine to be excavated until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. He had used the language of the Black Church, the promise of salvation and Black excellence, to build a digital plantation. It's not over, I said, looking Thorne in the eye. Vance's lawyers will claim the sonic ledger was tampered with. They'll say I'm a disgruntled kid from the projects who hacked the system. They're already trying, Thorne replied, his eyes flashing with a cold corporate fire. Vance's legal team is moving for a gag order. They're claiming the recordings were AI-generated deepfakes. But they forgot one thing. You didn't just record his voice. You recorded his rhythm. Thorne pulled out a laptop and opened a file. It was a spectrogram of Vance's voice from the night he had threatened to evict my mother. The FBI's forensic audio team has never seen anything like this. You captured the micro-vibrations of his biometric signatures. It's better than a fingerprint. It's a sonic DNA. But while the tech was impressive, the drama of the elite versus underdog was playing out on the streets of Chicago. Outside the FBI building, a vigil had formed. Hundreds of people from the South Side, many of whom had been donors to Vance's Prosperity Fund, stood in the rain. They weren't just protesting, they were singing. They were singing the old spirituals, the songs Vance had tried to weaponize, and the sound of their collective voices was a frequency no firewall could block. Yet Silas Vance was still fighting. Even from a cell in Cook County Jail, he was a predator with reach. Through his lawyers, he released a statement to the press, framing himself as a target of a secular conspiracy, and calling me a lost lamb who had been led astray by the enemies of the church. He was still using the Bible as a shield, still trying to convince the world that his BUZ lot exploitation was a form of spiritual discipline. He's going to get out, isn't he? My mother asked, her voice trembling. Not if I testify, I said. Julian, no, she gripped my arm. He'll destroy you. They'll dig up everything. They'll make you look like a criminal. He already tried to do that, Mama, I said, standing up. He told me that in this country, free is a lie told to the lazy. He told me God doesn't hear prayers from trash like me. But he forgot that trash is what you use to start a fire. The education I received at Harmony Heights wasn't what Vance intended. He wanted me to be a processor, a tool, a glorified ATM. Instead, he taught me exactly how the gears of power grind the poor into dust. He taught me the frequency of his own fear. Over the next week, the subplots of the empire began to unravel. Matron Beatrice, facing 20 years for child endangerment and labor trafficking, finally sang. She provided the physical evidence of the offshore keys Julian had suspected. Physical USB drives hidden inside hollowed-out Bibles in Vance's private study. The betrayal was complete. The Judas had turned on her master to save her own skin. But the most significant blow came from the sonic ledger itself. As Thorne's team decrypted the final layers, they found the medical reallocation file. It was the proof that Vance had personally vetoed Leo's emergency transport to buy a heart transplant for the son of a high-ranking politician who had been shielding the academy from state inspections. The price of a black kid's life wasn't just a metaphor. It was a line item in a budget. I spent my nights at the Southside apartment Marcus Thorne had secured for us. Not a penthouse, but a real home with windows that looked out over the neighborhood. I sat at a new piano, a simple upright that stayed in tune. I didn't play Mozart or the jazz codes Vance had forced me to memorize. I played for Leo. I played the silence between the notes, the frequency of the forgotten. The Tan Duong Trong Bong toy was gone, but the shadows remained. I realized that justice in America isn't a miracle that drops from the sky. It's a symphony that has to be written, note by painful note, by the people the world tried to silence. As the date for the grand jury hearing approached, I looked at the photograph Vance had used during the gala, the one of me and Leo on our first day, looking like angels living in the dirt. I took a pen and wrote one word across Vance's face. The underdog wasn't just barking anymore. We were rewriting the music of the city. The Cook County Courthouse was a gray monolithic slab of limestone that seemed to sweat under the oppressive humidity of a Chicago spring. For Silas Vance, it was just another stage. Despite being behind bars, he had managed to turn his pre-trial hearings into a televised circus of martyrdom. He didn't show up in a prison jumpsuit. His high-priced legal team, led by a shark named Sterling Vane, had successfully argued that appearing in anything other than his ministerial attire would prejudice the jury. So Vance sat there in a pristine white suit, clutching a gold-embossed Bible, looking less like a defendant and more like a saint being led to the lions. Outside, the city was vibrating at a dangerous frequency. On one side of the plaza, Vance's true believers, mostly people from out of state who had never stepped foot in the South Side, held signs that read "Free the Prophet" and "Persecution of the Faithful." On the other side stood the people of the South Side, the mothers in hospital scrubs like my mama, and the teenagers with laptops who saw themselves in me and Leo. The air was thick with the scent of rain, exhaust, and the electric charge of a coming storm. "Julian, look at me," Marcus Thorne said as we waited in the witness room. He was looking at a monitor showing the news feed. Sterling Vane was currently on the courthouse steps, decrying the digital terrorism that had falsely accused a pillar of the community. "They are going to try to turn you into the villain. They've already started leaking files about your mother's old medical debts and your troubled history in the projects. They want the world to see a thug with a keyboard, not a genius with a heart." I stared at my hands. They were steady, but my mind was a cacophony of 15 kilohertz feedback loops. I could still feel the weight of Vance's hand on my shoulder, the ring that I once thought was a blessing but now knew was the touch of a predator. "He called us trash, Marcus," I whispered, the words tasting like copper. "He told me God doesn't hear prayers from kids like me. He thinks that because he owns the high-definition cameras and the big words, he owns the truth." "He owns the noise, Julian," Thorne replied, his voice a deep, grounding bass. "But you own the frequency. Remember what Leo found. The math doesn't lie." The door opened and Sterling Vane stepped in. He wasn't supposed to be there, but in the world of the elite, rules were merely suggestions. He was a tall, thin man with teeth that looked too white and eyes that looked like frozen glass. He didn't look at Thorne. He looked straight at me, his gaze lingering on my collar just as Vance's had. "Julian," Vane said, his voice a polished, academic version of Vance's honeyed baritone, "I'm here to offer you a way out of this symphony of destruction. The Reverend still cares for you. He knows you were confused by the trauma of your friend's passing. If you recant your statement regarding the sonic ledger, the ministry is prepared to establish a $10 million trust for your mother's health care. She'll never have to scrub a floor again. She can live in a penthouse in Florida, far away from the trash of the projects. The bribe was wrapped in the same godly mercy Vance used to mask his malice. It was a gold mine, offer designed to bury the truth under a mountain of cash. $10 million? I asked, my voice flat. Vane smiled, a thin predatory stretch of the lips. It's a small price for the peace of the church. Think of your mama, Julian. Do you really want her dragged through a cross-examination about her unstable past? Do you want her to lose the only thing she has left? I looked at the tablet on the table. It contained the file of the last clicks Leo had counted. The clicks of the server hub that recorded Vance's final betrayal. I thought of Leo shivering in the quiet room, telling me he could finally hear the numbers. My mama told me that music is the only language God never uses to tell a lie, I said, standing up. My pulse was a perfect rhythmic 72 BPM of absolute certainty. Silas Vance didn't just kill my friend. He tried to delete his soul. You can take your $10 million and buy a new conscience because the one you have is out of tune. Vane's smile vanished. The mask slipped, revealing the demon beneath the skin. You're making a mistake, boy. In this country, a black kid's word against a billionaire's is nothing but noise. We will destroy your mother's reputation before you even finish the first sentence of your testimony. Then I'll just have to play it louder, I said. 30 minutes later, I was called into the courtroom. The ton duong of the law felt just as oppressive as the sanctuary of St. Jude. Silas Vance sat at the defense table, his eyes locked on mine. He didn't look afraid. He looked hungry. He still saw me as a tool, a glorified ATM for his ministry. As I took the stand, the prosecutor, a sharp woman named District Attorney Miller, asked me to describe the events of the night Leo died. I didn't start with the data. I didn't start with the encryption. I started with the sound. Reverend Vance told us that labor was prayer. I began, my voice echoing through the silent chamber. But in that basement, the only thing we were praying for was a breath of air that didn't smell like server exhaust. We were children, but to him we were just biological processors. When Leo, Caleb's brother in spirit, couldn't breathe, the Reverend didn't call a doctor. He didn't even stop his live stream. He stood there and watched a 7-year-old Lim D fade away, because calling for help would have interrupted the flow of donations. Sterling Vane jumped up. Objection. Hearsay and inflammatory. There is no physical evidence of this alleged conversation. The evidence isn't in the words, Your Honor, I said, looking directly at the jury. A group of 12 people who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. It's in the resonance. I pulled out a small audio transmitter Thorne had helped me calibrate. I plugged it into the courtroom sound system. This is the sonic ledger, I explained. Silas Vance thought he deleted the audio files. But he forgot that every time he spoke, the vibrations were captured by the internal cooling fans of the server racks. It's a ghost frequency. If you filter out the 60 Hz hum of the electricity, you hear the truth. I pressed play. The courtroom was suddenly filled with the low-frequency drone of the basement. And then, emerging from the static like a spirit from the grave, came Vance's voice. It wasn't the baritone honey he used for the public. It was the venomous Rit-Len hiss of the wolf in the sheepfold. A black boy's life is an acceptable loss. Archive the basement, kids. Let the trash burn out. The sound was undeniable. It was the DNA of a demon. Silas Vance stood up, his white suit suddenly looking like a shroud. He tried to shout, to cite a verse from the Bible, but the sonic ledger drowned him out. The Tan Duong Trong Bong toy had just been hit by a tidal wave of its own echoes. As the judge hammered for order, I looked at Silas Vance. For the first time, I didn't hear a pulse of fear. I heard nothing. The man who thought he owned the frequency of the city was finally and eternally silent. The silence that followed the playback of the sonic ledger wasn't just a lack of noise. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a vacuum. In that wood-paneled courtroom, the high-definition audio of Reverend Silas Vance's cold-blooded admission hung in the air like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. For 10 seconds, even the court reporter's fingers froze over her keys. Then the resonance hit. A collective gasp, a visceral sound of betrayal, rippled through the gallery. These were the people Vance had called his flock, the South Side families who had skipped meals to seed his ministry. Seeing them realize they were merely data points in a profit loss statement was like watching a cathedral collapse in real time. Order! I will have order! Judge Holloway's gavel thundered, but the frequency of the room had already shifted beyond his control. Sterling Vane, the elite shark who had spent the morning trying to drown my mother's reputation, was now a man standing on a sinking ship. He lunged for the microphone, his voice a frantic, discordant pitch. Your Honor, this is a gross violation of evidentiary procedure. This audio is a digital fabrication, a deepfake generated by a malicious actor with a personal vendetta against a man of God. I looked at Vane, then at Vance. The Reverend wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at me, and for the first time, his eyes weren't full of godly mercy or demon malice. They were filled with the hollow, terrifying realization that the trash had finally outcalculated the architect. The defense is entitled to a forensic audit, Judge Holloway said, his voice grave. But until then, the witness will continue. Mr. Reed, you mentioned a master frequency. Explain to the jury what we just heard. I leaned into the mic, my pulse a steady rhythmic 72 BPM. I wasn't just Julian from the projects anymore. I was the recorder of the truth. It's not a deep fake, Mr. Vane, I said, my voice resonating with a clarity that silenced the room. You can fake a voice, but you can't fake the resonance of a room. What the jury just heard contains the specific 60 Hz hum of the St. Jude basement's electrical grid, and the unique acoustic signature of the server cooling fans. Every building has a heartbeat. Silas Vance thought he could bury his crimes in the noise, but he forgot that noise is just music that hasn't been organized yet. I didn't make this audio. I simply filtered out his lies. The elite versus underdog battle was reaching its crescendo. Vance's team tried every sophisticated trick in the book. They brought in experts who tried to claim my math was flawed. They tried to portray Leo, my brilliant, suffering friend, as a troubled youth who had died of natural causes unrelated to the smart campus. But then, the final subplot of the Empire's collapse arrived in the form of a man in a black tactical vest. Marcus Thorne stepped back into the courtroom, holding a ruggedized laptop. Your Honor, Thorne's bass voice boomed. While the defense was busy questioning Julian's character, the FBI's cyberforensics team, using the decryption keys provided by the witness, has successfully accessed the Harmony Heights archive. The room went cold. Vance's face turned the color of ash. We didn't just find audio, Thorne continued, his eyes locked on Vance. We found the video logs. We found the internal communications between Reverend Vance and the medical board. We found the invoice for the new Gulfstream jet, dated the same day Leo's emergency transport request was marked non-essential. The sophisticated villain was finally trapped in his own web of data. The smart campus wasn't a school. It was a digital sweatshop where black children were used as biological processors to train an AI that was, in turn, used to scam their own grandparents. It was a cycle of exploitation so precise it was almost beautiful in a demonic sort of way. Julian, Dee Miller asked, her voice softening, What do you want the world to know about Leo? I closed my eyes for a second, hearing Leo's 60 BPM rattle in the quiet room. I remembered his hand, ice cold, reaching for mine. Leo wasn't a liability, I said, my voice cracking but holding its pitch. He wasn't a discarded student. He was a miracle. He was a boy who could see the math of the universe while people like Silas Vance were only looking at the bottom line. He died because a man who claimed to represent God decided that a black boy's breath was worth less than a luxury flight. But Leo didn't die in silence. He left behind a frequency that just broke this whole building. The payoff was immediate. The jury, men and women from all walks of life, many with tears in their eyes, didn't even need the full hour to deliberate. When they returned, the atmosphere was like a funeral for the elite. On the charges of human trafficking, racketeering, and involuntary manslaughter, we find the defendant, Silas Vance, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. But it wasn't a cheer. It was a roar of long overdue justice. People in the gallery hugged each other. My mother sobbed into Marcus Thorne's shoulder. And Silas Vance? He didn't have a scripture left to quote. As the bailiffs moved in to lead him away, I stood up from the witness stand. Vance stopped in front of me, his white suit now metaphorically stained with the blood of the children he had exploited. He leaned in, his voice a dry, hollow Ritalin hiss. "You think you won, Julian? You've destroyed the only thing that could have saved this neighborhood. You've turned your back on your own people's progress." "No, Silas," I said, looking him dead in the eyes of a wolf who had finally lost his sheepfold. "I just changed the frequency. And you? You're just static now." As they marched him out, the bailiff reached out and unpinned the platinum cross from his lapel. "You won't be needing this where you're going, Vance." The church in the darkness had finally crumbled. The karma dynamic engine had completed its cycle. The verdict had been read, the gavel had fallen, and for the first time in years, the air in Chicago felt like it belonged to the people again. But for me, the true end of the story didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened 3 months later, under the vaulted ceilings of what used to be the Harmony Heights Academy. The glass and steel fortress that Silas Vance had built as a temple to his own greed had been seized by the federal government and, through a series of complex legal maneuvers led by Marcus Thorne, was being reborn. The name Harmony Heights had been chiseled off the marble entrance. In its place, in simple, dignified bronze letters, it now read, "The Leo Reed Center for Acoustic Justice." It was a sanctuary now, in the truest sense of the word. The basement, the windowless data farm, where I had spent hundreds of hours tagging the frequencies of human suffering, had been gutted. The server racks were gone. The industrial cooling fans that had stolen Leo's breath had been replaced by a state-of-the-art ventilation system that pumped in the fresh, cool breeze from Lake Michigan. The space was now a world-class recording studio and a STEM lab where kids from the South Side could learn to code. Not to exploit, but to create. I stood on the stage of the main auditorium, the very place where Vance had stood in his $10,000 Tom Ford suits, preaching a gospel of prosperity while his basement was full of slaves. My mother, Clara, sat in the front row. She didn't look like the woman I had left in the projects. Her skin had regained its glow. Her cough was a distant memory thanks to the medical care Thorne had provided, and her hands were no longer raw from hospital-grade lye. They were folded in her lap, resting on a program that bore my name. "You ready, Julian?" Marcus Thorne asked, stepping out from the wings. He was no longer the elite outsider. He had become the architect of this new reality. "I've been ready since the quiet room, Marcus," I said. The auditorium was packed. Not with the silk-suited stakeholders of the Vance era, but with the families of the South Side. The mothers, the grandfathers, and the children who had been archived by the ministry. They were there to hear a different kind of sermon. But before the music started, I had to do one last thing. I had to face the shadow. 2 weeks earlier, I had visited Silas Vance at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. He wasn't wearing white anymore. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow and gray. The prophet of prosperity was gone. In his place was a common inmate, number 88241-05. He sat behind a plexiglass barrier, his platinum cross replaced by a plastic ID tag. "You think you've won, Julian?" Vance had whispered into the intercom, his voice a dry, rattling C-sharp. "You've taken my buildings. You've taken my name. But you'll never take the people's need for a miracle. Without me, they're just back in the dirt." "No, Silas," I had replied, leaning close to the glass. "They're not in the dirt. They're standing on the truth. You offered them a miracle that cost them their souls. I'm offering them the math to build their own heaven. You're not a martyr, and you're not a saint. You're just a 60 hertz hum that I finally filtered out of the mix." As I walked away, Vance had started to scream, a discordant, frantic noise that echoed through the sterile halls of the prison. It was the sound of a man who realized that in a world of pure frequencies, he was nothing but static. Back on the stage of the Leo Reed Center, I sat down at a brand new Steinway. I didn't have a tablet. I didn't have a frequency analyzer. I just had the keys. This piece is for the ones who were told their voices didn't matter. I addressed the audience, my voice steady and resonant. This is for the kids who were called acceptable losses. This is for Leo. I began to play. It wasn't the grief algorithm or the jazz codes Vance had forced me to master. It was a piece I had written called The Resonant Heart. It started as a low, mournful bass line, the sound of the South Side Projects, the screech of the L train, the rhythmic thud of the basketball. It was the frequency of the underdog. But then the melody shifted. It rose into the higher registers, a series of bright, soaring intervals that mirrored the math Leo had etched into the concrete wall. It was the golden ratio translated into sound. It was the frequency of miracles that were actually real. As the final chord resonated through the hall, a perfect, sustained G major that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of everyone present, the audience stood as one. There was no shouting, no hallelujahs bought with donations. There was just the deep, soulful silence of a community that had finally been heard. Marcus Thorne stepped onto the stage and presented me with a scholarship to the Juilliard School, funded by the liquidated assets of the Vance Ministry. It was the justice I had dreamed of, but it wasn't the payoff I valued most. The real payoff happened after the show. A small boy, no older than 7, walked up to the stage. He looked like Leo, big eyes, skinny frame, a mind that was clearly counting the lights in the ceiling. "Mr. Julian," he asked, "can you show me how to hear the numbers?" I knelt down, taking his hand, a hand that would never have to touch a data farm keyboard for a predator. "I'll show you something better, kid. I'll show you how to make the numbers sing." As the sun set over Lake Michigan, casting a golden glow over the Leo Reed Center, I realized that the church in the darkness had been completely replaced by a lighthouse. The elite like Silas Vance think they own the light because they have the gold to reflect it. But the underdogs like me and Leo? We are the ones who know that the light comes from the frequency of the soul. The symphony was over. The silence was finally at peace.
Để nối tiếp phần 9 với cái kết mở đầy ám ảnh này, tôi đã tinh chỉnh lại đoạn kết bằng tiếng Anh để đảm bảo văn phong đồng nhất với các phần trước. Bạn có thể chèn trực tiếp đoạn này vào sau phần 9 đã viết.
3 years had passed since Silas Vance was led away in handcuffs, leaving behind the crumbling shell of his empire. The Leo Reed Center for Acoustic Justice had become a beacon of hope in Chicago. I had become a concert pianist, playing venues across the globe, Yet the stages often felt like sterile echoes of the life I had escaped. Tonight, I was back in Chicago for a charity gala at the city's grandest auditorium. The hall was packed, and my mother sat in the front row, her face finally free of the shadows of the South Side. As I sat down at the Steinway, the silence of the room was heavy, expectant. I prepared to play the Requiem for the Forgotten, but as my fingers hovered over the keys, a sharp metallic sound cut through the air. A sound I hadn't heard in years. The rhythmic, piercing sound of a locker lock being picked. The exact frequency Leo had used to open Vance's secret ledgers. I squinted into the wings of the stage, where the heavy velvet curtains obscured the darkness. A small, gaunt silhouette stood there, motionless. It wasn't a trick of the stage lights. The figure had a distinct, jagged outline, a ghost in the machine. It was Leo. He was staring at me, his eyes wide, mirroring the innocence he had held even in his final moments of breath. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor, but the figure didn't retreat. Instead, it raised a hand and mimicked the motion of playing a phantom piano in the air. "Leo," I whispered, my voice lost in the sudden, frantic murmurs of the audience behind me. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the figure dissolved into the swirling mist of the auditorium's climate control system. I stood there, trembling, my hands hovering over the real keys of the Steinway. I didn't play the piece I had prepared. I began to play a new rhythm. A complex, chaotic, and beautiful sequence based on the metallic clicks I had just heard. As I played, I realized I hadn't just been playing for an audience. I was playing for a witness. When the final note faded, leaving the audience in a stunned, breathless silence, I looked toward the wings one last time. There was nothing but empty darkness. I walked out of the theater into the cold Chicago rain. As the drops hit the pavement, they fell in a rhythm. A staccato beat that echoed the SOS signal Leo had tapped out on his desk so long ago. Was it just the rain? Was it my own mind refusing to let go of the past? Or was Leo still here, guiding the frequency of my life? I didn't have an answer. But as I looked up at the gray sky, I realized I didn't need one. Some frequencies never fade, they just change form. And in the silence of the night, I heard the faint, ghostly sound of a piano chord. A perfect G major, echoing from the heart of the city.